BBC World Service. This is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry. This week, are we tired of talking about climate change? Now, Inquiry regulars will know that we normally start this programme with a story. This week, we can't. And that's because our question is about a story that's gone missing. We've noticed that the world's media seems to have dropped something. Climate change. Yes, there's the odd story here and there, but a subject that dominated the news 5 years ago seems to have largely disappeared. Since there's a consensus amongst the majority of the world's scientists that temperatures are rising, most likely driven by human behaviour, we wanted to know why climate change coverage has been drying up. Are we tired of talking about it? If so, why?
Part 1. A disappearing story.
In the late 1990s, I was living in Central America in Honduras, working in agriculture, and Hurricane Mitch, a Category 5 hurricane, tore through the entire region.
This is Max Boykoff. He's telling me about a defining moment in his life. 26 years old and on a volunteer project in Honduras.
I was down in the southern part of Honduras and had gathered with a number of community members. We could sense this ramping up. We lost power and then started to see the heavy rainfall.
That rain resulted in floods, killing over 10,000. When he got back to the US, Max Boykoff started a PhD, looking at what made places such as Honduras vulnerable to hurricanes. As his interest in the environment grew, he started looking more closely at how the media covered it.
I was looking around for this kind of research, looking at the quality and content of media coverage of climate change, and had realized that this hadn't been done to date.
Since no one else was monitoring climate change coverage, he started a project himself. It's called
the Media and Climate Change Observatory.
It's based at the University of Colorado, and it's the only one of its kind.
This is a project that monitors 50 sources around the world across 25 countries on 6 continents. And what we seek to do is put our fingers on the pulse of the ebbs and flows of coverage of climate change over time. So we monitor this month to month. It's not an exhaustive reading of all media accounts everywhere around the globe across all platforms, but rather this is just a way to get us talking productively.
The project started 10 years ago.
In 2004, there were relatively low levels of coverage. Around 2006 into 2007, there was an uptick in the amount of coverage. There was a high watermark in 2009.
The UN Climate Change Conference is open in Copenhagen. Representatives from over 100...
Delegates from around the world gather in Copenhagen for the largest global warming conference in history.
Denmark welcomes the planet to the conference designed to save the planet. We'll hear live from...
Facing a clock some say has ticked down to zero, today 192 nations came together to take on a potential global catastrophe.
This is our chance. If we miss this one...
For a few months, climate change was everywhere. It was the story of the year. But then...
From that high water mark to 2014, coverage has dropped. It's dropped 36% globally. It's dropped 26% in the US and as much as 55% in the UK.
Does that suggest that we're getting tired of talking about climate change?
Is this getting to be a topic that doesn't garner as much attention as it once did? There may be something to that.
Anecdotal evidence backs up those numbers.
Within the last year here in the United States, National Public Radio reduced its environment reporting team from 3 to 1 reporter. So we see examples of this unfolding quite regularly. There are certainly newsroom pressures. There's shrinking time to deadline. There's reduced resources to cover complex issues such as climate change that require a certain level of investigation, a certain level of familiarity with the contours and the nuances of the topics.
Online news sites are, in some cases, stepping in to fill the gap. If you know where to look, there are hundreds of them covering climate change. But it's becoming harder to bump into that kind of coverage. Mainstream news outlets aren't reporting climate change as they were back in 2009. So what happened? Why the drop?
Part 2. The Trauma.
I'm Jennifer Morgan. I'm the Global Director of the Climate Change Program at the World Resources Institute. I direct a program of about 50 staff around the world that are working on solutions to climate change. I represent us at the UN negotiations, the Kyoto Protocol. I think I've been to thousands of meetings over my 20-year career on these issues. Millions of hours, 20 years.
Hundreds of those hours were spent at that UN summit in Copenhagen 6 years ago, at the peak of media interest in climate change. What happened at that meeting plays a crucial part in this story.
Copenhagen was supposed to be the moment when the over 190 countries came together and agreed a new, legally binding agreement to address climate change. It was very much a great excitement, anticipation of really trying to finally get a global agreement since the Kyoto years.
And so what was it like when you got there? Do you remember sort of that first scene when you got through the door?
Oh, I remember it. I can paint it now. Walking in with a colleague of mine I've been working with for years and just looking at each other and saying, okay, we're here. Okay, we have to get this done. We have to grasp this moment. These moments don't happen very often.
Listen to the islands! Listen to the islands! Listen to the islands! Listen to the islands!
The scene itself in the conference center, it was very dynamic. There were many students there that had come in from around the world. So you would have, in some moments, kind of impromptu little demonstrations or speeches by some of the delegates.
Openly discuss the proposal from Tuvalu and from the other countries and openly discuss.
I remember the delegate from Tuvalu, who was a real hero for youth, giving a press conference and getting cheers. Plus you had all of the kind of what they call side events, workshops happening on research that people were doing. It was very much of a kind of an open trade fair.
Get away with anything less than a legally binding treaty.
Legal treaty now! Legal treaty now! Legal treaty now!
You had these rooms where the negotiators would sit for hours.
And hours and hours. After about 100 of those hours, the carnival atmosphere began to fade. It became clear the negotiations weren't going to plan.
In the middle of the second week, normally what happens is the options start to get narrowed down and you can kind of see the package emerging, and that wasn't happening, and that's when I think we all started to get very concerned.
At the end of the 2 weeks,
last-minute scramble in Copenhagen. Is a climate change deal still possible? Obama demands action, not talk, but the talks continue with no sign of an agreement.
The UN summit is said to be teetering on the brink of failure.
Well, reports from the Danish capital suggest that negotiators have so far failed to resolve differences about the size of emissions cuts and how much.
2 weeks of strenuous talks on climate change in Copenhagen wound down with an agreement, but it was non-binding. Was it to avoid an utter failure? And what comes next?
China's chief negotiator had been barred by security for the first few days. Sessions routinely suspended in the name of finishing on time. Developing countries said they'd been ignored, and the EU was missing from a final meeting where a last-minute, non-binding deal was drawn up.
It was terrible.
What was the mood immediately following the conference?
An exhausted defeat, just the deep fatigue, particularly from the European side, of just wanting to take a break for a little while on this international climate diplomacy stuff. You have to think about these negotiators. Their families hadn't seen them. You know, the personal sacrifice, it sounds crazy, but of really just, and believing of trying to make something happen, I think it was a trauma, just to kind of have put so much blood, sweat and tears into it.
So traumatic that in the years following the summit, many politicians avoided the subject altogether.
Right after Copenhagen, I think there was a sense of there needed to be a bit of a time out on the world leaders' side of things. So it went into, definitely a very low level of attention for a few years. The relationships of heads of state after Copenhagen and some were quite strained. Even months after, when I had some meetings with heads of state, I just found that the level of trust and kind of just a almost like us being psychologically burned by this, had stuck around. And I think that's also had a real impact on the willingness of these individuals to stay engaged.
Just as the media had tired of talking about climate change, so had world leaders. It dropped off the agenda at summits and conferences. As well as recovering from the trauma of Copenhagen, politicians had their hands full with Syria, the economy and Ukraine. But is that all there is to it? Or is there something more fundamental going on?
Part 3. Our Ancient Brain.
My house happens to look out over the Pacific Ocean, and so from a North American perspective, I'm literally at the edge of the world looking across 10, 15,000 miles of ocean over to Japan, and so it feels like I'm on the edge of the world. But I think it gives me a kind of a broad perspective.
The kind of broad perspective that helps when you're an environmental psychologist. This is Robert Gifford. He teaches at the University of Victoria in Canada, and he's been looking at why those amongst the general public who accept a link between human behaviour and climate change aren't then doing much about it. Is there something about the way our brains are wired that makes climate change a turn-off? 8 years ago, he started compiling a list of these psychological barriers.
I will now list those off for you. Number 1, ignorance. Number 2, environmental numbness. Number 3, uncertainty. Number 4, judgmental discounting. Number 5, optimism bias. Number 6, lack of perceived behavioral control. Number 7, ancient brain.
7 reasons. Quite enough to be getting on with. But over the years, he's discovered more.
Number 8, worldviews. Number 9, system justification. Number 10, suprahuman powers. Number 11, techno-salvation. Number 12, social comparison and norms.
And more.
Number 13, perceived inequity. Number 14, sunk costs. Number 19, perceived program inadequacy. Number 20, reactance.
20, a nice round number. But...
Number 21, denial. Number 22, functional risk. Number 30, confirmation bias. Number 31, dispositional pessimism.
If you know of a 32nd reason, do let him know. In the meantime, we're going to home in on just 4 of the 31. First up, our ancient brain.
According to the neurologists, our brain physically hasn't developed much for about 30,000 years. So at that time, we were mostly wandering around on the savannah or places like it. And our main concerns were very immediate, feeding ourselves right now, worrying about anybody who might try to take our territory. There was very little thinking at that time about what might happen in 5 years, 10 years, or 100 kilometers or miles away. It was all very here and now. So we still have the same brain, and we are capable of thinking about the future. Obviously, we're capable of planning, but the kind of default is to stick into the here and now, which is not very good for thinking about climate change, which is a problem that for many people is more in the future and farther away, or at least we think it is.
And then there's environmental numbness.
Well, as any advertiser knows, if you don't change your message, people will just tune out. And so environmental numbness is, yes, I've heard that message before, and so we're always open to new messages and pay more attention to new messages. So if governments or policymakers repeat the same message too often, people just tune out after a while.
We also tend to tune out when we feel helpless, he says. He calls this perceived behavioural control.
What can I do about this global problem? I'm just one person and there's 7+ billion people on the planet. I just don't have much control over this, so therefore I'm not going to do much about it because my contribution, even if I did everything, wouldn't make much difference. I'm a drop in the bucket or less.
And amidst those feelings of helplessness and numbness, when a climate change story comes along with elements of uncertainty, we don't handle it well.
Uncertainty is a really big problem. We've learned in my own laboratory from experimental evidence that when people feel a bit uncertain about an environmental problem in terms of climate change, if the future temperature might vary from a 0.5 degree increase to a 1.5 degrees increase, people will say, well, it's probably only going to be a 0.5 degree increase, so I'll keep flying to some tropical place. It's a kind of natural human tendency to kind of interpret information in a way that suits our personal interests.
These natural human tendencies, interpreting information in a way that benefits us, being unimaginative about long-term risks, becoming numb to a repeated message, and switching off when we feel helpless, make us ill-suited for maintaining an interest in climate change, whatever our views on the subject. And those are only 4 of the 31 psychological barriers on Professor Gifford's list. A list he describes as the diagnosis of a problem. He says if environmentalists want people to stay engaged, it's up to them to find a solution. And that's exactly what our next expert witness is trying to do.
Part 4. An inconvenient story.
I'm not sure that people need to engage with climate change at all.
Meet Joe Smith. You might be surprised to hear that he's an environmentalist. He teaches geography at the Open University in the UK. He says it's not just how the media has reported the story of climate change that's made people switch off. It's the raw material itself.
It's more or less unreportable if you just describe it on the page. It's complex, interdisciplinary, the findings drip out over time, and the boundary between science and policy and politics is a very messy one. And for all of those reasons, I think it's a real challenge for the media.
He's now working on several projects, trying to find ways of reviving public interest in climate change. And he's ruffling feathers.
My message that to communicate about climate change, we might not want to communicate about climate change, probably means I've dropped off a couple of Christmas card lists. And I think it's also true that criticisms of environmental NGOs on my part are a little unfair because they've got a very long list of to-dos. But I do think there's some wasted effort.
Wasted effort, such as the fear narrative, the greatest threat to humanity story. In 2006, millions sat in front of Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth. It won awards and became a global phenomenon.
This is what would happen in Florida. Around Shanghai, home to 40 million people. The area around Calcutta, 60 million. Here's Manhattan. The World Trade Center Memorial would be underwater. Think of the impact of a couple 100,000 refugees, and then imagine 100 million. We have to act together to solve this global crisis. Our ability to live is what is at stake.
The idea that we will mobilise any more people with fear messaging is wrong. I think we've knocked at the door of everyone that might respond to such a thing, but you've then also got to ask of whether it's an accurate and a full way of telling the science. I think it is more respectful to the nature of the science to say that it's one of humanity's most ambitious questions of the last couple of decades and the next couple of decades.
Presenting the science as a finished piece of work, something that can no longer be argued with, is a mistake, he says.
I think there was a tactical wrong turning in suggesting that by insisting that the debate's over, we can move on to the action, it somehow implied that the science was complete, that there were simply some facts on which we now stood. And that, of course, left lots of space for those people who have arguments about the actions on climate change to stand in the way of us having a proper public conversation about those actions because they were able to pick apart minor details in the science. It's not just that climate science isn't finished, it's actually unfinishable.
His solution? Make the science exciting.
You know, the rest of science, particle physics, cosmology's allowed to be really rather saucy. I would love to get to the point where we allow climate change science to simply be interesting. Enchanting even. As fascinating as any area of science, because it's a hugely ambitious and compelling mission.
You don't need to talk about climate change head on, he says. There are more compelling ways of talking about it.
So if you want to talk to a business person, you want to talk about energy security for their business or energy security for their nation. If you want to talk to a parent at the school gate, you want to talk to them about the health of their child, their experience of the trip to school. Wouldn't they be happier walking and cycling? And that just gives you a feel for the way actually talking about climate change doesn't have to involve talking about climate change to actually lead us to some really, really substantial actions on it. We don't need to wear a climate change t-shirt.
Fewer t-shirts then, and less talk of melting ice.
Most of us who are trying to do something about this have realized, for example, that the polar bear metaphor is not a great one. It's far away. Yes, we have some sympathy for this poor polar bear, but it's not close enough to our own lives.
I think there's definitely a shift in narrative showing how much better what your quality of life can be with renewable energy, how you're going to get to work, what the public transport is. If you connect that, it becomes something very real. And as we know, all politics is local.
Some environmentalists are doing this already, starting positive local campaigns around food waste and second-hand clothes, rather than warning about threats to humanity. And that's because, in answer to our original question, it's clear that we are tired of talking about climate change. It slipped down the agenda after that disastrous Copenhagen summit. But we've also been told that it's our psychological makeup that's to blame. It means that we're almost designed to switch off from the subject. So in the coming years, perhaps the greater challenge for environmentalists isn't figuring out the science, but finding a way of telling a story about climate change that keeps us switched on.
The Inquiry is produced in London by Charlotte MacDonald and Simon Mabin. You can listen to previous editions of the show on our website. If you're interested in science stories, you might like our inquiry that asks, are pandemics inevitable? And you can demand an inquiry. Get in touch on the World Service Facebook page or on Twitter. We're at BBC The Inquiry.